Hello and welcome. This is going to be the final video I make before VCT China starts. Then, as we go on, as week one of VCT China starts, we're going to make a little bit of a recap of that week and then do our pick'ems for that week as well in the same video. And then after that, we're going to make some other videos where we just kind of go through each team. Then we're going to make pick'ems, obviously, for week one of the other regions as well, and talk a bit about those changes they've made. In this video, though, I'm going to just be looking at to power rank all 48 teams. As we've seen that been done by Platchat, I thought this would be a good opportunity to do that myself. I'm going to do it a bit differently from them. I'm actually not going to rank them on a tier list, as I already have sort of a document for that where I've ranked each and every one of the teams like this. So if that's all you're here for, here you go. That's probably not very smart considering I want people to watch my video, but yeah, there you go. If that's what you wanted. But basically what I'm gonna do here is just kind of talk about each team very quickly. Some teams probably more than others, but mostly I was just gonna put them sort of in a tier list in terms of like, okay, are they gonna contend to win Toronto? Are they expected to make Toronto? Expected to make playoffs, and so on and so forth. And this one is more about the expectations I have for the team, rather than actually how good I think the teams are. And also, by the way, that list is based on their performances, so I don't really take into account changes they've made. But yeah, should we start? Shouldn't we? Let's start by with 100 Thieves here. These are gonna be in letter order, so that's why the colors are a bit mixed and matched. But yeah, so we start with 100 Thieves, and I would say like this. Okay, for 100 Thieves, I don't think they're expected to make Toronto. I think if 100 Thieves don't make playoffs, though, there are some serious changes that need to happen. I do think they're a good team and definitely could be here, maybe even here if they're playing really well. But currently, I would say if they make playoffs, I'm pretty happy with what they've done. Moving on now, we have 2G Esport, 2Game Esports, and I'm gonna put them down in bad teams. I do think there is potential for this team to become a playoffs contender, but that's about how far I could see them going. Like, I could see them contending for a playoff spot. I could see them making playoffs then, obviously, but I'm not expecting them to be a team that are expected to make playoffs, if we say that much. I'm not expecting this team to be one of the first teams to make playoffs. Meanwhile, 100 Thieves, I would say I'm expecting to be that sort of team. 2G feels more like a team that's going to be like, if they're lucky, they might be contending for a playoff spots, basically. These teams should be contending for a playoff spots, and I just don't see 2G being here. They're kind of same with all gamers. I think they've made some changes which I've kind of liked. Although I'm not very sure about them. They still arguably is the worst team right now in the world. And therefore I'm going to put them in bad teams. Same with Apex. I do think, once again, Apex is a team that could come here. I do think we saw some potential with Apex compared to 2G and All Gamers, where I feel like we didn't really see anything, which is why I'm not going to do that with most of these, but I'm just going to put Apex here for the sake of it, as I do feel like the potential we saw with Batu and Floor and everything could actually become something, although I don't see it being very likely. BBL. I do think at this point I'm going to put BBL here. I think they're kind of similar to 100 Thieves, where they should make playoffs. I do think BBL was really good. Like, they could make Toronto. That's how good I think BBL are. And I would probably put them on a kind of a similar level to 100 Thieves, at least currently. Moving on, we have Billy, which, if we look at it in terms of China teams, I'm probably going to expect them to make Toronto. Um, I do think actually China is interesting because I do feel like there's a couple teams that should expect themselves to be able to make Toronto. There are a couple of regions where I feel like that's the case. Um, but these teams are basically like, okay, if we don't make Toronto, we probably failed. Uh, but yeah, so Billy is the first team here. So keep in mind, basically every single one except for Toronto contenders are completely that. This is why I have a separate tier list with every team where I've ranked them in order. This is more. All of these are in general pretty um, regional, while this one is obviously not regional, meaning the teams in these four. So, for example, Billy, I might consider on the same level as these two teams. It's just that I think China is a bit weaker of a region, so they're going to be up here, right? And when it comes to Boom Esports, I'm actually gonna put them here. I think Pacific has a very competitive region this year, and I do think Boom is gonna be a playoffs contender. I think they're gonna be able to upset some teams, and I do think they're gonna be able to win some games. They looked all right in Pacific. I do actually think so. There's one team in Pacific that I'm still gonna put in bad teams, which we're gonna come to later. Quite a lot later actually. But I do think Boom is gonna be a playoff contender, and it's gonna be the same with Cloud9. I think Cloud9 they are a team that could make playoffs, but I do think there's just too much competition in Americas right now for a team like Cloud9 to make playoffs be an expectation for them. Or at least for my personal expectation to have them go to playoffs is not really the case because of the amount of competition there is in Americas right now. With DFM, I'm feeling kind of similar. I'm gonna put them here. I'm gonna put them a bit region to region here, I think, just to make it look nice. Um, but yeah, I'm gonna put them in playoffs contenders as well. I don't think that if you're a DFM fan, you're gonna be displeased if they don't make playoffs. But I do think that they have that potential. Maybe even with an upset, make Toronto. But they're going to be pretty big dark horses. But I do think they have the potential to make playoffs. And now we come to DRG, which is actually going to be the second China team that I'm going to put in expected to make Toronto. Which some might say is a bit wild, but I do think Dragon Raider Gaming looked good enough to make it. And I do think I'm a bit concerned with their changes, but either way, even if I'm a bit concerned with their changes, with the thought of how good they've looked already, I'm still expecting this team to be a Toronto, like a contender to make Toronto. Like they should be that team. When it comes to DRX, I'm gonna put them up here. I do think they fumbled the bag a bit in Bangkok, but I still think at their top form, I think DRX is actually better than T1. Although T1 obviously had such an insane run, I do think that DRX kind of fumbled the bag and probably could have beaten T1 on their day. But obviously it wasn't their day, so T1 actually made playoffs. So it was actually like DRX could have made playoffs instead of T1 if they just had a better day, in my opinion. Now we come to EDG, which is the second team I'm going to put in Toronto contenders. I still think they are up there. It's actually, funnily enough, a team which at this point I could see them missing playoffs if they have a bit of a poor run. I could, or not missing playoffs, sorry, missing, not going to Toronto actually, which is the first time I've said that. But I do think that EDG steps up so much in internationals that I feel like you can never really count them out in contending to win a trophy. But obviously, if they don't make Toronto, this team is gonna have major changes made. But I do think there is a chance for EDG to miss their first international. Moving on, we have Evil Geniuses, which I am gonna put in playoffs contender with Cloud9. I will say they're probably the second worst team in in Americas, but I do think Americas is that much of a competitive region that I could see EG making playoffs. I do think I do think that it's more of a thing where if they make playoffs, it's like shit, let's go, more than a okay, this is what we need, what we should have done. Like that's kind of how I felt, how I'm feeling. Like one of the top teams need to probably have fumbled pretty badly if EG is gonna make it. Either that or EG just need to have stepped up quite a lot. Either way, playoffs contender is where I feel like EG are. Now we come to Fnatic, and Fnatic is a bit of a difficult one to me because I feel like with the roster they have, Fnatic should be here. They should be here. Like, I don't care if you think what they look like, they should be here. But I just simply cannot put them there right now. But I feel like anybody who has watched Fnatic in previous years should know that this team, like if and with the thought of that they had a Doom Bros as well, which has been one of the best coaches in the entire world for so long. Sure, as an assistant coach, but I think him and Milan will probably be pretty equal considering how big of a pickup that is. I'm gonna put them here though for now. I think if Fnatic doesn't make Toronto, it's gonna be a disappointment. Maybe they're gonna be like, oh well, Leo didn't play or whatever. But I do seriously believe that Fnatic, if they don't make Toronto, there's gonna be more changes coming. And I don't think I am alone in that. Moving on to FPX. I'm actually gonna put FPX in here. I'm gonna put them. I'm just gonna make it so that we have this sort of thing going on where I have them in a specific order like this. I think I'm gonna do EMEA, blah, blah, and then I'm gonna have EMEA, APAC, Americas, and then China. Just so it looks nice. But basically, FPX for me is a team that did struggle slightly in China. I do think they can make Toronto. I'm not expecting it though, because they have made some pretty big changes. And sure, maybe you can't really take that into account a lot of the time. But I do think not only have they made a lot of changes, they also weren't really one of the best teams in China looking at kickoff. I do think they should make playoffs though, but I don't think it's going to be a disappointment per se if they don't make Toronto. Moving on to Furia. Furia is probably the second team in Americas, which I'm going to put down here. Pretty sure Americas is actually the only region where I would say they have two bad teams. But at the same time, I do also think it's the most competitive region at the top. Which is why I would say like this. If you look the average team in a region, I would probably put Pacific the highest. If you look at the sort of top half, I would probably put America's highest. If you look at sort of like the middle of the pack, I would probably put. Actually, no, middle of the pack, I would put America's higher, and then EMEA is sort of like a middle ground where like they have one team that's obviously the worst, but then one of the worst, but then other than that, they don't really have a terrible team, but they don't really have many absolutely incredible teams right now either. But yeah, moving on to Foot. I'm gonna put them here as well next to BBL. I do think they're kind of similar to BBL, although I'm a bit more excited for BBL because I do like BBL's roster a bit more. And I do actually think BBL has the higher chance to make Toronto with what we saw. I do think, yeah, they're expected to make playoffs. I will say there's quite a lot of just playoffs contenders in EMEA, which we're going to see in a bit. But I think these are probably the only three. No, actually, I think one more team is expected to make playoffs. Actually, no teams are expected to make playoffs, but there's going to be one team more expected to make Toronto, and one team in Toronto contenders. The rest, I'm pretty sure, are going to be playoff contenders here. Actually, no, there's going to be one more team in bad teams. But I think actually EMEA is probably the most balanced region in general, is what I'm gonna say. Moving on now, we have G2, which I'm pretty sure everybody knows that I'm gonna put them in Toronto contenders. I do think actually G2 is the team that's, I would say, at this current moment, you need to put T1 up there. But I do think there's a pretty large argument, and I think if you watch Platchet and everything, they're saying the same. And I do think so that there's a pretty large argument, and I would probably argue that G2 were the better team. I do think T1 was obviously better on the day because they won, but I do think that G2, if we were to make the rematch, G2 would probably win. If we were to play 100 games between G2 and T1, I genuinely believe that G2 would win 65% of the time. I genuinely think 65 out of 100 games, G2 would win. I think they're that much better, but currently, if you look at my rating, I'm still going to have them at the same rating just because T1 won the last event, and you need to take that into account no matter what. I think if you don't, you're kind of throwing. Moving on, we have Global Esports, which I'm actually going to put here, which hurts a bit because it's global, but their roster looks really good. And Elevated has, I actually trust quite a lot in Elevated as well. And I do think this roster could make playoffs. I don't see them making Toronto, but they could definitely make playoffs and be a bit of an underdog. I could definitely see that. Moving on now, we have Gen G, which straight up just should make it. They should make Toronto. I don't care. Gen G should make Toronto. Moving on, we have Giant X, as this is going to be the first EMEA team that goes in playoffs contender. They had a pretty poor kickoff, but I do think they have the players and have shown with this core that they can be good. And I do think the players they've added have been upgrades. So I am expecting this roster to be able to make playoffs. But I think just because of their poor kickoff performance, I'm not as high on them as I have been before. Moving on to JDG, I'm reluctant to doing it, but I think I'm actually going to put JDG in bad teams. JDG is one of those teams, though, where it kind of hurts to put them there because I know the potential of their players. Like, they have some really good players, but they are just not looking good. They just straight up are not looking good, and that's why I have put them in bad teams. When we go over to Carmine Core, I'm actually gonna put them in like a high playoffs contender. I do think that Carmine Core themselves probably expect themselves to make playoffs, but I think there is so much competition in that region right now that I could see them missing it. Like, that's kind of my thoughts on KC. There's so much competition in that region that I could see KC missing it, especially with the roster they have. Also, I'm a bit doubtful on, just simply because of like all the weird team dynamics and everything like that. Actually, when what I said before, by the way, I just realized there's definitely going to be two teams that are expecting to make Toronto more, and then one team in Toronto. There's actually going to be 4 teams in the top 2. I forgot about Team Liquid there for a second, but yeah. Moving on, Koi is going to be the second EMEA team in bad teams, and there's going to be one more team here, from APAC, but otherwise that's about where my bad teams end. Moving on, we have Crew, which I feel like I need to look. Okay, there's 6 teams that's gonna make it here, right? Eh. I think I'm gonna have to put them here. I genuinely believe Crew are a good team, but to me, I would say they're better than Cloud9 and EG. But I just see that there is so many teams in Americas right now that just looks better. So I have real a really a big difficulty seeing Crew make it to playoffs. Um, so yeah. Um, Actually, wait, isn't there 8 teams in the playoffs now instead of 6? I'm pretty sure there is. Either way, I have a difficulty seeing them making playoffs. I do think these 3 teams will probably be contending for 1 spot if it's 8 teams in the playoffs. If it's 6 still, they're not. They're gonna have a really difficult time. But I do think these 3 teams are probably gonna be fighting for that 8th spot, if that's the case. Moving on, we have Leviathan, which with the current roster, I'm probably gonna put next to 100 Thieves. I do think they're expected to make playoffs, but I don't think they will have the expectations to make Toronto, considering they've made quite a lot of changes. I mean, they let Natank go. So they've literally made a player change, which sure, some might say, well, that player change is because they're expecting to make Toronto. But I just don't see that being the case. I think, at least to me, which is what this video is about, if Leviathan make it to playoffs, I would say they should probably need to go pretty deep in playoffs as well. But I wouldn't be disappointed if they didn't make Toronto. And I kind of see Loud in that same boat. Kind of a team that's like, I don't think they're gonna make Toronto, but I think if they don't make it at least somewhat deep into playoffs, I'm probably gonna be pretty disappointed. Moving on, we have Gentlemates, which I'm gonna put in playoffs contender. I think there's actually gonna be like what? Okay, there's just gonna be one more team in playoffs contender here. But I do think it's a very EMEA is a very competitive region, but not a very top to top region right now to me. MIBR. Let's just see, what teams do we have left? I'm actually gonna put MIBR. This might be dumb, but I'm gonna put them here. I'm gonna put them in expected to make Toronto. I do think. Oops! I just realized I've not changed name to Made in Brazil here, and it just says team name. This was like a template I did, and so I'm sorry for that. But yeah, this is Made in Brazil, MIBR, whatever you want to call them. I might have accidentally missed that with some other teams. I don't think I have though. Hopefully, that would be embarrassing. Either way, I do think MIBR, if they don't make Toronto, I would probably want to see changes on that team. Although it is a very new roster, I would put these at like, yeah, I would be reluctant if they're like, they just barely doesn't make it. But like, I do think that a team with Aspas should be making internationals. That's just kind of my opinion. So yeah, that's all I'm really gonna say. Navi, pretty obviously playoffs contender. I don't think I do have my doubts on Navi. I'm not that high on this roster in general, but I just can't put them in a bad. I can't consider them a bad team. I do think they have the chance to make playoffs. I do think they have the players to do so. I'm not so sure that they will. Moving on, we have Nova, and this is actually going to be the first China team that I'm going to put in playoffs contender. We have actually quite a lot of China teams left, but Nova is going to go into playoffs contender. I do think that Nova are looking really good, and they could even make Toronto if they have a really good run, but I think they'd have to have some miracles happen for that to happen. And I think they should be fighting for a playoff spot, but I don't know if they're gonna be too unhappy if they don't make it. Moving on to NRG, I'm gonna put them in expected to make playoffs. I know probably every single player on that NRG roster are sitting there being like, if we don't make Toronto, something has gone wrong. But with the turbulence in the team right now and everything, I'm not very high on this roster. Not to the point where I don't think they're gonna make playoffs, but I do think if they don't make playoffs, there is something seriously wrong. Like seriously wrong. They should probably make it somewhat deep in playoffs as well, but I do think if they don't even make playoffs, there is something that needs to be changed. I just realized we've actually not had a lot of APAC teams either, because now we're gonna have 3 in a row as we're going to Nongshim Red Force, which I am going to put here. I'm gonna put them with no other APAC teams right now in expected to make playoffs. I do think that Nongshim is a team that could make Toronto. I do think there is 3 teams that, obviously these are expectations, so I'm just gonna say the third team. Actually, there's 4 teams. No, I'm gonna say 3 teams that I expect to make it. Let's just put T1 up in this as well. And there we got the 3 teams I'm expecting to make Toronto in APAC. But I do think, obviously, I do think that a team like PaperX that we have right here are going to be here. I do think there's quite a lot of teams that is in this region. Like, I do think RQ will also be here. And there's going to be, I would say, 1 more team there as well. I do think APAC is a very competitive region right now. But yeah, I do think RRQ, PaperX, and Nongshim should all make playoffs. I am pretty low on PaperX, but obviously they could make it. But they could make Toronto, and they could go really far in Toronto even if they look good. I am just doubtful with, and you kind of have to be considering how they looked in APAC and how disastrous of an ending they had. But although they lost 2-0, obviously, to DFM and everything, I still have pretty high expectations on PaperX because we know what this roster can do. So I can't really put them lower than that. When it comes to Sentinels, Sentinels is the second team that I expect to make Toronto for Americas. And I'm pretty sure the final Americas team. I think if Sentinels doesn't make Toronto, there's seriously something wrong. And they're gonna have to make changes. But overall, yeah, I think Sentinels should make Toronto no matter what. Moving on, we have Trace, which I'm also gonna put here, obviously, with Bilibili and DRG. I think they should make Toronto. I think, as I said, with DRG, I think their changes make it that they should make Toronto. Basically, with the changes they've made, their goal is to make Toronto. And I think Bilibili is the third best team, or third or even second, arguably, with how bad Trace has looked in this region, and that's why I am putting them up here. Titan Esports Club, I am gonna put in. Actually, I'm gonna put Nova up to expected to make playoffs, and I'm gonna put Titan Esports Club here. I do think Nova, actually thinking about it, is one of the better teams. Like, Nova could be argued 5th coming into this. I do think that's bad. I do think they're not 5th. I do think if I were to argue them anywhere, it would probably be like seventh to eighth. But I do think if they don't make playoffs, I'm probably going to be a bit disappointed. Team Heretics is the second EMEA team that I'm going to put in expected to make Toronto. Is EMEA the only region where I have 4 teams in expecting to make Toronto? I think so. And it's because of Fnatic. Like, I think that there is so many teams in EMEA that could make it, that I expect to make it. As the next team, Team Liquid, I'm also going to expect to make it. With how Team Liquid has looked, if they don't make it, to be completely frank, it's a failed stage 1. And I think Team Heretics are kind of in the same boat. Maybe not as Fnatic, which I was going to compare them to because of how poor both those teams looked in playoffs. But obviously Fnatic has been like that for like over a year, where they've like just looked like slightly too bad to make anything. But to me, I'm expecting them to make Toronto. And if Team Liquid or Team Heretics doesn't, there's probably going to be changes made. I think Team Liquid is probably the team there that I'd see if they don't make Toronto. There's the least likelihood that they make changes, just simply because the expectations for that roster to begin this year wasn't very high. But I do think that we should be expecting them to make it. Talon, we're going to put next to these teams here. I do think that Talon is a team that, although they finished 4th, I do think could just as likely have finished 8th. I think RQ, okay, maybe not 8th, like 7th, 6th, 7th. Like, because I feel like, okay, maybe not PaperX, but at least RQ and Nongshim both have beat them in kickoff. And I do think PaperX has that potential. Moving on, Team Secret. I'm going to put them down here. Kind of reluctantly, sadly, because I really like the Team Secret roster. But they've just not looked good enough to be any higher than this. And the reluctantly is actually more towards putting them here, which is kind of sad. But yeah, I'm going to put Team Secret in playoffs contender for now. Then we move on to Tyloo, and this is going to be the 3rd team in China that I'm going to put in bad teams. Only region with 3, and I think that's for a reason. China is still the worst region to me. But yeah. Moving on, Team Vitality is going to be the one and the only Toronto contender for me in EMEA. Although I do think that there are some other teams that could make it that could win it. I think these are like the main teams that should be contending for it. Let's put it like this so we can see all teams in a presentation mode. So we get all in one row, so it looks nice and clean. Moving on to Wolves, I do think that both Wolves and Sheilai should be expected to make playoffs. So here we got actually 8 teams. Titan Esports Club, obviously, as I said, could make it. I do think that if we're going to put the bottom here, I would say this. I would say Wolves or Nova could definitely get upset by Titan Esports Club. Maybe even JDG, but obviously I would say this is a bit harsh, but I'm going to put them there. But I do think maybe even like this. I'd say Wolves is probably the most likely not to make playoffs here. But I do also think they're the most likely out of these teams. Or maybe not the most likely, but they're one of the teams here that I feel like out of these 2 teams, I see Wolves being more likely to make Toronto. But I do think Nova is overall the more like consistent side, which I'm more confident that Nova will make playoffs than I am that Wolves will make playoffs. But if somebody were to ask me to bet on a team to make Toronto between Nova and Wolves, I would pick Wolves. Which might sound dumb, but it's basically just like I feel like Nova is a really solid team, but not much more. Wolves has the players to make Toronto, but they've not shown that level yet. And then for the final team, we have Zeta Division, which, as I said, there was going to be one APEC team in the bad teams category, and it's going to be Zeta. I do think Zeta just straight up looked bad in kickoff, and I don't see that changing. I really don't. But yeah, there we go. That's going to be my ranking of all 3 regions and what I think of each team, what I'm expecting, and so on. I do think this is gonna be ended up being a pretty long video. But yeah, I do think some of these could probably change. A lot of these could probably change over time. It's gonna be really interesting to actually watch this by the end of stage 1 and see how right I was with these rankings. As I do feel like when I'm talking about right in terms of stage 1, it's mostly just like this order sort of deal. Like, are these teams in sort of these tiers? Or would I put them any different by the end? But yeah, here we go. This is my tier list. And I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.